5.
So I thought it was the nothing to do with me, gov, budget.
4.
I think on the Labour front bench now, we just don't have anyone who really gets business, really gets economics.
3.
If there was an Olympic sport for self-damaging behavior, the Russians would be the world champions.
2.
I've got the feeling this is a government that still just doesn't realise the scale of the task that lies before it.
1. We have liftoff.
Welcome once again to Planet Normal, the Telegraph podcast with Alison Pearson.
Hello.
And me, Liam Halligan. Back in October, Chancellor Rachel Reeves delivered a budget which raised spending by a staggering £70 billion a year during this Parliament, paid for by £30 billion of extra borrowing and £40 billion of extra taxation each year, a 5% rise in the overall tax burden. Most of these taxes were on business, not least the £25 billion increase in employer national insurance contributions, and most of them are yet to be implemented. They don't come in until early April, the start of the new fiscal year. But just the prospect of these tax rises has crushed business confidence according to countless surveys and led to layoffs and a huge slowdown in hiring, with the economy contracting, tax revenues plunging and the Chancellor's sums unravelling. So on Wednesday this week, Reeves came to the Commons to give a spring statement, an emergency budget in all but name. We're going to talk about this spring statement, co-pilot, a discussion involving not just you, economic sage that you now are, but with another of Britain's leading economists, former Treasury wise man, founder of the consultancy Capital Economics, and our fellow Telegraph economist, Roger Bootle. But before we get out our calculators and consult our spreadsheets, running our slide rule over this spring statement, not that you ever knew what a slide rule did, co-pilots, I hear that you lately won an award, Alison. Was it the Lion in the Wizard of Oz Courage Award or something else?
I wish I'd never mentioned this to you.
But you did.
I showed you my certificate. That's where it started to go wrong, wasn't it?
What was it, 25 metres breaststroke or something?
I was at the Margaret Thatcher Centre at the University of Buckingham for a Freedom Conference.
God, you've come a long way since you were a shouty lefty student in your dungarees and your monkey boots. The Margaret Thatcher Conference, crikey.
Yeah, but I brought about the fall of the Soviet Union, as Planet Normal listeners know, with my Cyclists Against the Bomb badge. So I was able to move to the right after that was safely sorted out. Actually, it was a great event, lots of fantastic speakers. Toby Young was there from the Free Speech Union, and I did my speech about my shenanigans with Essex Police and was able to talk about some of the quasi-political prisoners we have in our country, Liam, and we're going to be doing more on that on Planet Normal in coming weeks, I hope. But they were very, very kind, and they gave me an award for courage, standing up for freedom of speech. And as I explained to them, some are born brave, some achieve braveness, and some have bravery thrust upon them. And I was very firmly in the third category. And I got home with my framed certificate, which I showed to himself, who took one look at it and he said, the last person to get an award for courage was the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz. So there's nothing but tributes from the men folk I'm closest to.
There you go.
Is there really? No, however bad I am, Liam, however timid, at least I'm not Rachel Reeves.
Talking of which, what a segue. I like
Look what we did there.
So we have got Roger Bootle in our midst. Roger, welcome to Planet Normal. It's great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here.
Why don't we do this? Let's hear from Roger. We've literally all of us watched the spring statement. Let's hear what Britain's leading economist thinks of it. And you and I can fight for the number 2 and 3 slots, Alison. Let's hear what Roger thinks of the spring statement. And then you and I can quiz him over the next half hour or so. And hopefully all will become clear as mud.
Well, I suppose I was depressed. I was amazed at the same time because I've done so many of these budgets. It really is a budget in all but name, isn't it? You know, to see the joshing between the Shadow Chancellor and her, all that is so familiar. My overwhelming feeling is that actually, this may come as a surprise to you, I think some of the things that Labour are now doing aren't all bad. The trouble is, first of all, they went badly wrong, I think, last October. She shouldn't have increased borrowing and increased taxes the way she did, and that comes down to increasing spending. And the other thing is, the amounts of the correct things they're doing are so tiny. I mean, to be boasting about an extra 0.2% of GDP for defence, it's utterly pathetic. So I've got the feeling that this is a government that still just doesn't realise the scale of the task that lies before it.
I think that's right, Roger. If you look at the welfare reforms that Labour is really risking party unity, the left of the Labour Party, of course, is absolutely incensed that they're even touching the beached whale that is now our welfare state. In total, they may save or slow down the rate of increase in spending by up to 5 billion quid a year. That's on spending of 1,300 billion pounds a year. And the headline for me, the sort of nerd's headline, is that this spring statement, even before we've looked at the OBR documents, we haven't had a look, but just looking at the summaries of the documents, I can tell you that the government is saying it will borrow over the next 2 years no less than 18 billion pounds more than it was going to borrow before this statement. 18 billion pounds over 2 years, Roger. That's pretty much twice the savings from all these welfare reforms with all the political fire and brimstone that they're going to bring. So far from fixing the foundations and other Rachel Reeves bingo words, and we can go through bingo words in the statement, far from fixing their foundations, she's actually doubling down on the risks she's taking with our public finances. Yeah. It really concerns me. But, Roger, who cares what you and I think? Because we've got today's John Maynard Keynes in our midst. Here she is. So, Alison, the gilts markets around the world, equity markets are poised, Wall Street's on the line, Singapore's waking up. What did you make of it?
I think she's got some brass neck, hasn't she, our Rachel? She's objected to being called Rachel from accounts on the basis of her decidedly dodgy CV, bigging up her rather shallow experience. But we have had quite a few entertaining emails. You'd be happy to know this, Roger, from actual people who work in accounts objecting that it's not right to say that Rachel should be called from accounts because she wouldn't get that job. So she's objected, Liam, that this is misogyny. And, one of my absolute pet hates is when women who prove themselves to be deeply incompetent, embarrassingly bad at a job, suddenly start deciding that people are saying you're really rubbish at this job, love, because it's a woman. No, it's because you're completely useless. I thought it was, in a way, what we expected. She was scrambling to fix the mess that Roger's just described that she made in October when they'd been already talking down the economy hugely, hadn't they? Saying, this is all dreadful. She's still sticking with the fiction of the 22 billion pound black hole, which she promptly decided to fill by giving 9 billion in wage increases to her mates in the public sector, 11.5 billion in overseas climate aid, always top of anybody's list. That is, Liam, really. So I thought it was the nothing to do with me, Gov, budget, pretty sort of shameless stuff. But, as Mel Stride, I thought he gave a very good response. We can talk about that.
We did too. Yeah. Generic looking a bit upset next to him because thinking, blimey, he's a bit good.
Yeah, he was good. And he talked rightly about her public humiliation. He talked about the economy being in a perilous situation. Talk about the look on Robert Jenrick's face. The look on Keir Starmer's face was an absolute picture. He wasn't beaming rapturously at his Chancellor. There was a slightly, what the hell are we doing here? Just the one thing that she said that really annoyed me was she said working people are paying the price of economic irresponsibility. We would never do anything to put household finances in danger. Let's just talk to a random person on any street in the United Kingdom and ask them, how are your household finances doing?
She's a bit good, Roger, eh?
She is good, yeah.
She's a bit good.
I feel like Robert Jenrick.
Yeah, I thought the kind of buzzword bingo was absolutely awful. The Labour Party is the party of work. We won't put more taxes on working people. Of course, the increase in employer NIC, which has led to hiring dropping off a cliff. The burden of that is largely on working people. She talked a lot about increased global uncertainty. Maybe we can talk about that. She talked about, we've seen what happens when a British government borrows too much, banging the drum about the Liz Truss mini budget again, even though, Alison, as we've said on Planet Normal a lot in recent months, government borrowing costs have been higher than they were at the peak of the so-called mini budget crisis in October 2022 for most of the last 3 months, and they're still going up. Let me just put this to Roger. Joking aside, you are a macroeconomist of international repute. You think about these issues very, very closely. What do you think about this "the world has changed" line from Rachel Reeves, trying to shift the blame for her forecasts falling apart, her sums not adding up since October, trying to shift the blame for that on specifically Donald Trump, US tariffs and global events, dear boy?
Yeah, I don't really think that stacks up because the budget was in October. Trump didn't take office until January. I think you're right to emphasise the terrible effect on business confidence and ultimately consumer confidence from those tax rises last October. That's the main thing.
Just the prospect of them, of course, because they come in a week.
Next month.
Yeah.
I think the really worrying, if you want to get worried, is that this business about the world's changed, increased uncertainty. What is she going to say and do as and when the world really does turn adverse? Because we don't know what Trump's going to do yet.
We don't know what China's going to do.
Exactly. We don't know the consequences of all that, or the knock-on effects on us from whatever happens in Europe. So it could be an awful lot worse. My overwhelming feeling, is that this is a government which really just didn't understand basic economics. They don't understand how you get economic growth. They seem to think you just sort of conjure it up out of thin air. They don't realise the way that regulations are clobbering small businesses and taxes are as well. They just don't understand where growth comes from. With one exception, I think they have done something good on the reform of planning, which the Tories sort of flirted with over a number of years, didn't do very much. They're absolutely right. I wish they could actually extend that lesson more broadly and think, hold on, what can we actually do which reduces costs for businesses and gives them the incentive to expand?
But it's all about the vested interest you take on, isn't it? If you're going to take on the big house builders as a vested interest, if you're going to, take on farmers and try and extract more land from agriculture, compulsory purchase orders and so on, that's one thing. How about taking on other vested interests like the trade unions?
Absolutely.
How about taking on other vested interests that stop employers from properly employing people? I tell you, a huge unexploded bomb in this, and I must say, Andrew Griffiths, Robert Jenrick is going to be a bit worried about Mel Stride. He should be worried about Andrew Griffiths as well, who I think is putting in a decent stint on the shadow front bench as shadow business secretary. Of course, Mel Stride is shadow chancellor. Andrew Griffiths has been tweeting out, as Reeves was on her feet, and I think he's exactly right. He spotted in the OBR documents that none of these forecasts include the impact of Labour's employment bill. Now, Labour's employment bill is going through the Lords at the moment, and even on the government's own estimates, it adds £5 billion a year to the costs to firms of employing people, because it gives you sick leave rights, it gives you tribunal rights, unfair dismissal rights from day one, as well as a host of other reforms from the 80s and 90s being unravelled, going back to the 70s. And once you include those costs, it strikes me, Roger, hiring is going to fall even more, business investment is going to be even lower, and growth could slow more.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. Going back to the forecasts and the OBR, which of course comes in for a lot of stick, I do think that the whole thing's got an air of unreality about it. It's amazing. She was boasting about increases in GDP forecasts several years out of 0.1 or 0.2%, which is frankly, well within the margin of error. It's the slip of a pen, frankly. And the OBR has just reduced its growth forecast for this year since last October from 2% to 1%.
Yeah.
And we're supposed to believe all this stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that what Roger was alluding to about them, not understanding growth, I think part of the problem was that Labour came in with this sort of extraordinary promise that they wouldn't raise taxes on so-called working people. So working people don't mean, the people like my friends in town who run a deli and a cafe who work 7 days a week, but they didn't come under the Starmer-Reeves definition of working people. So they thought that by not raising taxes on working people on their pay packets, they would raise taxes on the businesses that employ working people. But as Roger said, without understanding that these business people would in due course pass on those increases. So I think they do know what they're doing, but I just think they're picking who they pick on, as it were. Something I was interested in, Roger, is Rachel Reeves talks about these global headwinds, but in my extensive reading that Halligan will tell you about, if we compare the UK to comparable European economies, the cyclical activity data has moved from the UK being materially above the European average since last summer to well below. So in fact, she's fibbing, isn't she? Because actually comparable European economies are somehow doing better in these global headwinds than us.
Yeah, I think that's fair. There are, of course, big differences between different countries. I mean, Germany, we know, has been very badly hit indeed. Some countries, Spain, Portugal, Italy, are doing relatively well. But yeah, I go back to what I said before. Most of it is clearly a self-inflicted wound. On this point about whether they understood what they were doing, I mean, I suppose they must have understood to some extent, but I think they sort of fell for their own publicity, which is a big danger in politics. That's to say, I think they sort of believed that lack of growth was basically because it was an incompetent Tory government, and you just got rid of the Tories and magically things would be an awful lot better.
And gave lots of speeches saying the word growth
ridiculous.
Many times.
I read something, I guess it must have been the Telegraph, I don't know if it was you, Alison, but I read something the other day which horrified me, also amused me. An unnamed cabinet minister was quoting another unnamed cabinet minister as saying that we thought we'd get growth quite easily because if you raise wages, that gives people more money to spend, and more spending equals more output. I mean, you couldn't make it up, could you?
This is Soviet economics. This is literally Soviet economics. I mean, I've had conversations, in recent years with people who are now on the Labour front bench, quite senior people. I can't disclose because I'm a journalist and they were off the record, but trying to convince me that you can do quantitative easing for the people. What does that mean? Print loads of money and give it to the people. We did it for the bankers, we can do it for the people. And I responded, if that worked, Argentina would be in the G7.
Absolutely.
If that worked, the Roman Empire wouldn't have collapsed.
Exactly.
Absolutely insane. And yet these, people who think that, not as students but as adults, are now in senior positions running the country. I mean, to what extent, Roger, do you think, compare the politicians now with the politicians we had when we sound like two old codgers.
We are.
Of course, I'd never say three old codgers on this podcast.
You daren't do that.
I'd get a rolling pin thrown at my head. But, back in the day, I mean, even, I remember talking to Dennis Healey a lot, Labour Chancellor, seriously knowledgeable bloke about the economy. And I think on the Labour front bench now, we just don't have anyone who really gets business, really gets economics.
I think that's right. I mean, Healey was an intellectual giant, but he wasn't the only one. Lots of them were really very, very able.
Peter Shaw, for instance, in the Labour movement.
Peter Shaw was absolutely terrific. So this lot aren't in the same league intellectually. But over and above that, it's the lack of business experience which gets me. I think I'm right in saying there's not a single member of the cabinet who has worked for a private sector business. Never mind run one or founded one, actually worked for one. I mean, this is, if it's true, it's largely true, then, you've got to have a completely warped attitude, haven't you, towards where prosperity comes from and what effects you're going to get on the economy by shoving up taxes and regulation.
I think Rachel's trying to make Jeremy Hunt look like an economic titan, to be honest with you.
Well, I think in some ways, by comparison, he is.
That's what I mean. I mean, being new to the dismal science, I mean, something that leaps out at me that it's quite hard to get your head around, and I don't think the public is aware of it. As Liam has tried to explain to me, we are paying £100 billion interest on our debt annually. And I just wrote this down, 100,000 million pounds of British taxpayers' money seems to be caught up in this Ponzi scheme. Yeah. Are you worried? Is there going to come a point when the markets will just look at this house of cards and say, we're not going to go on with this joke anymore?
I think it's possible. I mean, you've got to think about this thing both historically and by comparison to other countries. We've been here before. I keep saying whenever I write about this that, after the Napoleonic Wars, the debt ratio in this country, public debt to GDP, was pushing around about 240%. It was 250% at the end of the Second World War. So we've been there before and we worked it down. It can be done. But, you've got to ask yourself, how is it going to be done? Then looking at us internationally, we're obviously much worse off in this regard than Germany. But we're actually in a better position than France, better than the United States, better than Japan. There are lots of countries out there who've got a serious fiscal position. What you ask me if I'm worried. What worries me is that here we are with this debt level. We haven't fought a war to bring us here. There could be a shooting war in the future. Let's hope not, but there could be. The economy, although it's on its knees, it's not in a deep depression. What on earth could these numbers be if things got really, really bad? They could be up there way, way above 100% of GDP. That's what worries me. And then I think the markets would have a real fright.
The way we got out of the debt after the Second World War, of course, Roger, as you know well, you've been writing about it all your adult life, is that we had a baby boom. We had massive demographic expansion. We grew like Topsy. We had all kinds of developments in the British economy which generated that growth. And we managed to expand GDP so you had a bigger economy that could shoulder the debts. Since the global financial crisis, in contrast, the British economy, like a lot of the Western world, has barely managed 1% growth.
That's right.
After, when Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came in, debt to GDP was more like 50%.
Yep.
And they had 3 or 4% growth for the next 5 to 10 years. And this is the problem. We don't seem to be able to get out of second gear in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And yes, if you look at the headline numbers, as I know you do, debt to GDP is still looking, middle of the pack when it comes to the Western world. But our increase in our debt to GDP is an outlier.
Yeah.
The increase in debt to GDP since the COVID pandemic, during the COVID pandemic, because our lockdown was so ridiculously stringent, and because we spent so much money on furlough, and because we massively expanded quantitative easing, which really spooked financial markets, even though our headline number isn't as bad as the Italians, for instance, or even the French when it comes to debt to GDP, the rate of increase is alarming. And I know you talk to lots of people in financial markets, as do I. There is fear out there that sterling, that the British government with its finances is sailing very, very close to the wind. And I say again, the 10-year gilt yield, it's not something we often talk about on Planet Normal, but these issues are now going mainstream. It's 4.6, 4.7%. That's the highest government borrowing rate in 25 years, Roger, and on a much bigger stock now of debt.
Oh, yes. I mean, it's not a comfortable position, is it? And the one thing that Rachel from accounts, actually, was she not from customer complaints? I think she was. Rachel from customer complaints.
If only she was from accounts. There you go.
Yes,
We
exactly.
can tell Planet Normal listeners that. If only she was from accounts.
One thing she is right about, she's been banging on forever, hasn't she, about growth being the thing. She's right about that. The way to get ourselves out of this is by growing the economy more strongly. But as she's discovering, that's easier said than done. And other than the points I made earlier on about planning reform, they haven't done much to boost growth at all. These increasing regulations, the point about employment rights you've talked about earlier, I mean, that's a killer for many small businesses. The increases in business taxation, all these things are very, very, very bad for growth. So, and that's before we get a real hit from the global economy, which could be out there.
I've just found in the documents, as I've been talking with the first and second best economist in Britain, the number I've been looking for in the huge reams of documents, and I found it on page 118 of the OBR's 180-page document, is debt interest costs. As the Chancellor said in her speech, debt interest costs are due to be £105.2 billion this year. That's 2024, 2025. And then they rise each year to become £131 billion by 2029-30.
Terrifying.
Let me just say, here and now, I think that is a gross underestimate.
Because
I don't think interest rates are going to come down the way many economists forecast. And I don't see tax revenues emerging to the extent the OBR is saying, even from these lower levels of growth. Because we've had the impact of these announced tax increases in October to some extent because businesses are spooked. But when they actually are implemented, I think you then get another shock effect. And I would bet my house on her increasing taxes again in October.
Really?
Absolutely. Because it's who she is.
It's in the DNA.
It's in the DNA.
Well, that would be a shot in the foot, it seems to be, wouldn't it? I mean, clobbering the economy still more. I know the numbers are frightening, and you could easily paint a scenario under which gilt yields go up against this backdrop, and then you get massively increased debt interest payments. I don't think that's bound to happen. It's in the balance, frankly. I mean, I was interested the way in the run-up to this statement, all sorts of commentary was saying how she's hedged in by the OBR. They won't say this, they will say that, blah, blah. I don't think that's quite right. She's hedged in by the financial markets.
Yeah,
You
totally,
and I,
totally.
all three leading economists on this podcast know this. They're no fools. It's not the OBR, it's the bean counters and the dealers in the markets looking over these things. And if she puts another step wrong, they're going to exact a heavy price. And up go the gilt yields, up go the debt interest payments. I mean, we've somehow or other got to get the debt scenario trending down quite significantly. Isn't it worrying, don't you think, that whenever this chancellor, and to some extent it was true of the last few chancellors as well, talk about what's going to happen to bring this ratio down, it's always in the future, way into the future. I mean, today, for instance, we had all these measures. That
Lord, make me virtuous, but not today.
Not yet, which are coming good in 4 or 5 years' time. That doesn't really impress me, I have to say.
I think that that's right about her being hedged in by the markets, Roger. But it strikes me that she's also hedged in by a public that is not aware of the situation you guys have just outlined, and also a media class which shows total dishonesty and will a tiny bit, a parmesan shaving of universal credit. Is this austerity again? And you actually think, I said in the column this week, that it's literally like the bar steward on the Titanic deciding whether to cut down on the olives or the crisps. And through the porthole, we see the iceberg looming. And there is a lack of...
I agree with that.
Telling people, she talks about making tough choices. No, she doesn't make tough choices because there's a terror that all of the Labour voters will say, oh, it's not very nice to take away disabled person's car or whatever benefit we can't afford. And it's probably true, Liam, isn't it, across the political class? People don't want to say, we owe 100,000 million every year on debt interest. People aren't interested in that. People understandably want to know, can I afford my heating bill, and so on. So, I mean, just to finish, I absolutely think that one thing they could do would be to scrap net zero targets.
Absolutely.
Immediately.
I agree with you.
And start drilling and fracking and getting oil and gas of our own out of the North Sea. Are we going to let the British people get poorer and poorer so that Labour can feel virtuous? No, thank you.
Now on to our latest Planet Normal guest, something a bit different given our earlier focus on the spring statement. Mike Calvie was born in Oklahoma to a modest family, his father working in the local oil industry. As a young man in the late 1980s, he wanted to be a Wall Street hotshot. But then the Berlin Wall came down, and Mike Calvie started working for the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London and began visiting the newly emerging post-communist economies of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. By the mid-90s, Mike had totally changed his plans and moved to Moscow, joining other bright young Westerners working to build a whole range of new businesses, as the Russian economy opened up and the West, for the most part, sought to embrace the former Cold War enemy. Mike Calvie ended up living in Moscow for more than 20 years, learning the language, marrying his Russian wife Julia, and raising 3 kids together. He also built Bering Vostok, a hugely successful investment firm that raised billions of dollars from Western pension funds, insurance companies and university endowments, earning them spectacular returns from exposure to some of the world's fastest growing companies. The financial media empire Bloomberg described Mike Calvie as, quotes, a legend in the Russian market, with a reputed aversion to any kind of foul play. And as someone who also lived in Russia for part of the 90s and again during the 2010s, and who's known Mike for many years, I can attest that is true. But in 2019, after getting embroiled in a business dispute, Mike Calvie ended up in Matroshka Tishina, Moscow's most notorious prison, sharing a cell for several months with 7 burly Russians. Now free, fully exonerated, living back in the West, and having severed all business ties with Russia, Mike Calvie's book, Odyssey Moscow, has just been published. He joined us on Planet Normal to discuss Vladimir Putin, the war in Ukraine, and his love-hate relationship with Russia. Mike Calvie, great to have you here on Planet Normal.
Liam, I'm extremely happy to be here. I've been a fan of Planet Normal since the very beginning. As I'll explain later, when I listened to your very first episode while I was under house arrest in Moscow, walking on my tiny balcony. And when I heard you and Allison talking about lockdown and everything else, I was thrusting my hand and my fist in the air and saying, yes!
Mike, you've written this quite astonishing book, Odyssey Moscow, one American's journey from Russia optimist to prisoner of the state. Briefly, tell us how you first came to Russia. Tell us where you're from and how you ended up living in Moscow in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It was really a total coincidence. I grew up in Oklahoma, the Midwest, no ethnic roots from Russia, no interest in Russia, Russian language growing up. But I was a child who graduated from university in 1989, which of course was the year of communist revolutions and a history-changing year. And on a backpacking trip around Europe in between graduating from uni and starting my job, I, was reading the news. I was meeting people coming back from Berlin or Prague or other places like that. Then I realized as a young man that I was living in a historic time. So I went back to my job in New York after that, but I started following the news and the events that were happening rapidly.
Because you were going to be a Wall Street hotshot, right?
I was working for Salomon Brothers, actually, whose London office was in this very building where we are right now, one of the most powerful firms on Wall Street in the 1980s and the subject of Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker, which was written at the time I worked there. But, coming back to the question on Russia, in 1991, I had an opportunity to move to the EBRD when it was first set up.
The European Bank for Reconstruction and
Exactly,
Development.
set up in London to invest in the Soviet Union, and I leapt at the chance.
This was a new kind of World Bank-style organisation,
Exactly.
what we call a multilateral, to channel state and private investment into these new emerging economies, including Russia, including Eastern Europe.
Exactly. And my boss from Salomon had gone there as the chief investment officer, so he knew me as a guy who understood a little bit about resources and energy. So he hired me.
Because you grew up in Oklahoma, right?
Exactly.
All
He hired me
country.
as one of the first 50 people or so who worked at the EBRD, and it was still the Soviet Union. I traveled to Moscow for the first time actually a month after the Soviet Union ceased to exist, and I remember converting $100 into rubles. I had the wits to do so on the black market rather than at an official rate, and I got a shoebox full of rubles, which I couldn't even spend because people at the time didn't want rubles. So I ended up coming back to London with half of a shoebox full of useless rubles.
So how did you feel the first time you went to Russia? I'm sure you thought you might stay a few days, maybe stay a week. What happened to you over the next 5 to 10 years? We should disclose I first met you in the mid-90s when I went to live in Russia. Tell me about the 10 years after you first went to Russia.
It wasn't love at first sight. I would say it was fascination at first sight. But my first impressions of Moscow were grim. Everything was gray and brown. People had a scowl on their faces. And I was fascinated, but I also felt it to be very harsh. But as I got to know the country better and started to meet Russians, I had some colleagues, Russian colleagues at EBRD, I really understood that when you scratch through the surface, Russians can be some of the most sentimental, loyal friends that anyone could have, and, that very genuine. So the opposite of superficiality. So I came to fall in love with Russia, with the culture, the people, but it took a while.
But the 90s in Russia, they were the Wild East, right? What was it like for a young man?
I mean, I moved
living in Moscow.
Yeah, I started traveling there when I was 24, and I moved there full time at the age of 27. I remember meeting an American former ambassador named Bob Strauss, who was a Texan, very classic old school guy, who said, if I was a young man and had $10,000, I'd move to Moscow and bet it all.
But
then he said, if I was an old man with $10 million, I'd still only bet $10,000 on Russia.
An Oklahoman doing an impression of a Texan here on Planet Normal. Who says we're a parochial British podcast?
There you have it. Don't ask me to do any other kind of accent.
So, in all seriousness, it's obviously sort of socio-economically fascinating. It was geopolitically fascinating. You grew up at the height of the Cold War, as it were, but it was also very interesting from a commercial point of view.
Yeah, it was a horribly unfair and tragic time for old people in Russia, but it was a spectacularly fun and exciting opportunity for people who were young. So there are a lot of people my age, Russians, who started businesses in that time, trading, building consumer goods or brands. The country needed everything.
And the Western world was
free-for-all.
seriously interested,
Exactly.
not just in Russia's resources, but its people, its markets.
Of course, through the Yeltsin era, of course, there was enormous encouragement from the West to support Russia, to move there, to look at investments. And that continued through the first 5 or 10 years of the Putin regime as well.
So tell us about the kind of business that you built. And I know you're quite a modest man. You did pretty well.
Well, we started off investing in consumer brands and goods that Russians needed.
So you raised money from Western institutional investors.
Raised money from Western institutional investors for what's
Pension
called a
funds,
private equity
insurance
fund.
companies.
And we invested it in money into private Russian businesses to help them to build factories or to expand working capital or marketing. And we originally were doing that across traditional industries ranging from beer and chocolate to mineral water and forests. But eventually and pretty quickly, we shifted towards investing in technology and software. And we were the first investors in companies like Yandex.
Which is Russia's Google.
Which
many tech specialists think remains technologically superior to Google.
It's a spectacular group of brilliant minds who came together to build that business. Arkady Volish, Ilya Sigalovich, and many others created a absolutely world-class and spectacular business that beat Google at its own game without any benefit of regulation. But we also had other investments in companies.
It's worth saying that one of the guys who set up Google was actually ethnically Russian as well.
That's true, Sergey Brin. Yes, that's true. I think that we believed in Russian talent. It's not just about brains. It's about the type of education they have, which makes them great problem solvers, but also the resilience and the competitive spirit. It was very fertile ground for entrepreneurship. Not easy, because every 7 or 8 years there was a catastrophic economic crisis when the currency collapsed and the stock market collapsed. But if you could stomach those and you didn't have too much debt, you could double down in the downturns, which we did, and it paid off enormously for our investors.
So your investors, I should add, were seriously bespoke Western investors. They were pension funds, they were insurance companies, they were university endowments, very
exactly,
heavily regulated, very cautious investors.
Yep.
Huge regulatory compliance you had to go through. But once they were in the market, a lot of them got a taste for it, not least because during that period, Russia was always either the best performing market in the world or the worst performing market in the world.
Exactly.
You just had to pick the right year.
Yeah, that's right. But I think there were more good years than bad ones. But there was a lot of competition that financed themselves with borrowing or debt. And so when the markets turned down, they often went out of business, and that created a further great opportunity for us. But ultimately, our success was because of Russian technology brains. It had nothing to do with the government. It was companies who were building products and services, mostly internet related, that helped to transform customers' lives.
And it's worth saying that you built funds that invested not just in Russia, but across the former Soviet Union.
That's right.
In Central Asia.
Yes. Kazakhstan has been our most profitable country, in fact, yes.
Big returns for your institutional investors.
Absolutely.
Then what happened?
We ended up in a dispute. So we had probably 100 different investments with different partners. And 99 times out of 100, we didn't have any problems or issues with our fellow shareholders. We sometimes had scrapes and conflicts with competitors or others, but we never had any problems with our own fellow shareholders. But that changed with one investment where we'd done a merger between a bank that we owned and another one. And to keep a long story short, 2 of the shareholders of the other bank had stripped cash out of the company. We ended up in a dispute. We started to sue them in London, in the London Court of Arbitration. They realized they were going to lose, so they orchestrated an FSB case against me to have me arrested.
That's the successor to the KGB.
FSB is the successor to the KGB, correct.
And before we get on to how that transpired, that situation, we should also say not only had you moved to Moscow, Mike Calvie, you had properly unpacked. Tell us about your relationship with Russia at that time, not just your business relationship.
Yeah, I met my wife, Julia, after living there for about 2 years. We got married very quickly and have 3 beautiful kids who are half Russian, half American. I'm very proud of the fact that they share that dual heritage. And Julia, of course, has been rock solid, especially during these last these last years when we went through a hugely stressful time for our family. She's an amazing woman.
And tell us about that stress. What happened? I remember you in the market at that time. I remember Bloomberg reporting you as, constantly referring or often referring to the fact that Russia was a difficult market. It's obviously a very complex place to invest. But because you had all these bespoke Western institutional investors, and because of the way you are, you were the kind of guy, you were a straight dealer. People across the Russian business community, the Western business community, always held you up as somebody who would walk away during the suitcase under the table moment. You'd always keep it, as we say in Russian, чистый, above board, clean.
Yeah, I think that when my arrest happened, there was an explosion of support for me across Russian civil society and within the business community, but also even within the government economic blocs, mainly because they knew me as, first of all, someone who was honest. If I had a single partner, a disgruntled former partner or something like that, it wouldn't have happened. So reputation was what saved me. But also, I think a recognition among especially the business elites, that I was someone who had done more to help the Russian economy than almost anybody. That
you raised literally billions of dollars that were invested in Russia.
And the kinds of companies that we invested in and succeeded did so without any government involvement. It was the perfect riposte to anyone's criticism that Russia was just a natural resource economy. And I believed it. Obviously, I wasn't naive. I saw the arbitrary arrests that took place, but I labeled most of those as political. I thought they were oligarchs who had been involved in privatization or people that started to exercise political influence, and that those arrests couldn't happen to someone like me because it would be deeply irrational for Russia. But if there was an Olympic sport for self-damaging behavior, the Russians would be the world champions. And my arrest was definitely an example of self-damaging behavior by Russia.
Because the word went around the international community, investment community, crikey, if Mike Calvie's getting into trouble in Russia,
then it could happen to
everything
anybody.
He knows about Russia, probably knows more about the Russian commercial scene than any Westerner on earth living there, Russian family, massively connected.
Well, and it wasn't a sudden conflict. It had been brewing and simmering for almost 2 years. It had gotten pretty heated. I say heated literally because before one tense negotiation I had with our enemies or our opponents, my apartment in Moscow suddenly caught fire, literally 3 hours before the meeting. I went from the fire to the meeting with the guys who immediately said, well, it had nothing to do with us. But during that time, I was consulting with friends of mine who are within, I would say, the business elite or the economic regulatory elite of Russia. And they all encouraged me to stand my guns. And also they gave me bad advice in hindsight, telling me that it's not possible that the Russian security services would arrest someone like you who's done so much for the economy without a proper investigation, without a proper process. And that proved to be very bad advice.
It's worth saying, Mike, of course, that, the majority of your business life in Moscow, across Russia, across the former Soviet Union, you're doing everything in Russian. You learnt Russian to such an extent. You didn't do languages at university. You have no ethnicity, Slavic ethnicity, unlike a lot of Western people doing business in post-communist Russia. So you're dealing with all these linguistic and cultural difficulties, which you embraced. You love those differences.
Well, even an American can learn a language in 30 years. But I think there was a cohort of business people, entrepreneurs, mostly Russians, that were my exact same age, that we all grew up together. Many of them became among the wealthiest and most successful entrepreneurs and tech giants in Russia. And many of them became my friends. So yes, I was speaking Russian, adopted a Russian sense of humor, which is not international, as you know, but it's very unique and it's wonderful in its own way. So yes, I did feel very much at home there.
So the book Odyssey Moscow, it's part about, your backstory growing up in Oklahoma. It's part about how you went to Russia, how you built the business. But it starts, at least the book starts, with a knock on your door. And a chunk of the book is a prison diary.
That's right.
Tell us about the knock on the door and what happened.
Well, it wasn't a knock on the door. It was pounding on the door by several giant fists that I could hear. And I heard it, got out of my bed, wearing nothing but my shorts. And
we're in downtown Moscow.
In downtown Moscow. Hearing the door shaking, I realized there must have been 10 or 15 men on the other side. And before I could figure out what to do, the door burst open. They burst the door open, and several men with guns charged into my apartment, shouting at me to put my hands in the air. So of course it was an enormously stressful experience. That began an ordeal which, led to interrogations and a 2-month stint in a notorious Russian prison before I was released and then put under house arrest for another 2 years.
I must say, your prison diary, the scenes from the prison, you shared a small cell with 7 burly Russian men. You became a kind of band of brothers. Tell us a bit about your cellmates to whom you dedicate this book.
That's right. I dedicate the book to the men of cell 604. I was expecting the very worst. After 4 or 5 days of interrogations by FSB and investigative committee interrogators, where they told me, you really need to admit your guilt and then we can negotiate a deal, I realized that they were going to be trying to put me under pressure in prison to confess to something that never happened. So when they told me I was going to be moving to a permanent cell there, I imagined being put into a cell with a bunch of hardened Chechen warlords or something, and was really expecting the worst. So they moved me there. They told me they're moving me there at 10:30 at night, which is just before lights are about to go out. So I figured it was on purpose. They take me up these stairs with the scariest siren sound you've ever heard. I call it in my book the Psycho siren because it reminded me of the scene from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, the shower scene with the screeching knife attack. So it was spine chilling. When I get to the cell door, the guards knock 3 times and open, and I see 7 men standing in, including a couple of huge guys. But as soon as they see me, their face lit up in a big smile, and they said, "Michael!" So the guards shoved me in, the door closes, and the guys all came to shake my hand and started to...
They've read about your case in the
papers,
papers,
been
right?
watching. There was a TV in the cell, so they've been watching about my case. They knew more about my case at that point than I did because I'd been in total isolation. And to them, I was a celebrity. So they just started to give me things like a clean towel or a clean T-shirt. And we sat at this table. The lights switched off, so it was very dim, but we still had time to pour a cup of tea for each of us in these little plastic or rubber cups. And one of them looked at me in the eye and said, "Novosелье," which is the Russian word for like housewarming that you give or welcome. And then they each started to introduce themselves by name. And the very last guy said, "Don't worry, the scariest moment has passed. In this room, all of us are decent people. Everything is going to be okay." And after what I was expecting, going into that cell, expecting violence, expecting intimidation, to have that kind of a welcome was truly inspiring.
Tell us a little bit more about life in the cell. Reading the book, you all turned into sort of little housewives.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, but there was definitely
Cleaning rosters.
I would say more like a band of brothers. It was like there was a camaraderie, there was a sense of humor, there were rude jokes and exchanges of.
Did they look after you?
Yeah, they gave me advice. They were under much, much worse circumstances than me with almost no chance of freedom. I had the support of the President of the United States, the entire business elite of Russia, several even ministers within the Russian government.
Who were speaking out publicly.
And a giant fund with the enormous resource for battalions of lawyers and PR agents and everything. My cellmates had none of that. And yet they still were offering me advice. They were offering me support. I'll never forget one of my cellmates, a guy named Andre, who had been there for 3 years in Matroska Tishina, not yet even tried or convicted of anything. So truly guilty until proven innocent. He was heading off to his final trial hearing date, knowing he was going to get a sentence of 15 years. And yet that morning, just before he left, he asked me if there was anything he could give me help on, any advice about my case, because I was having a minor procedural hearing the same day. So it was really inspiring. I would say what I hope people will take away from the book is condemnation for that unjust system, but also a sympathy for average Russians, because, of course, the biggest victims of that system are Russians themselves.
Well, Planet Normal listeners can read a lot more about you online and your case. The book is coming out literally as we release this episode of Planet Normal. Just in the final couple of minutes, Mike, how do you feel about Russia now?
Well, I'm pessimistic about Russia itself. I'm still optimistic about Russian people. I do agree with the Trump administration's urgency in trying to bring about an end to the Russia-Ukraine war. People who support Ukraine and its independence should be among the ones with the most urgency about that, because time is not on Ukraine's side. Obviously, the devil is in the details and how to end the war permanently between those two countries so that there's not a resumption of war 2 or 3 years down the road. That's going to require complex negotiation, which I hope all the sides and parties are up to. But certainly at least what they're trying to do, I think, is something that's overdue, and I strongly support.
I think it's true to say, Mike, that you lived in Moscow longer than you lived anywhere else.
That's right.
In the world, longer than you lived in the United States.
That's true, yes.
You do think of yourself as a Muscovite, right?
Well, I'm an American Muscovite. I'm still very proud to be American and proud of my motherland in Oklahoma and my roots there. So I cherish that. But Russia's got a dear spot in my heart. Obviously,
after all this,
it's a love-hate relationship. I hate the system. I hate the FSB. I hate the ruling caste of security people who rule the country and probably will for at least another decade, if not more. But I love Russian people, the sense of humor, the loyalty that they show to their friends, and the sentimentality that they have. So there's a lot of things that are deeply still fond in my heart.
And of course, you love your Russian family, and your wife is sitting next to you in tears.
She is. Well, she didn't come here for me. She came here for Liam Halligan, who she views as a rock star, one of her favorite people. So it's hard for me to compete with you, Liam.
Mike Calvie, thanks for appearing on Planet Normal. So there you have it, Alison. Odyssey Moscow, one American's journey from Russia optimist to prisoner of the state. It's just been published by History Press. What do you think?
Absolutely fantastic guest. Mike Calvie, wow, what a guy. And delighted to hear that Mike and his wife Julia are Planet Normal fans. And I tell you, Liam, what made me laugh was that Mike Calvie was under house arrest in Russia when we were broadcasting about lockdown in the United Kingdom.
Isn't it unbelievable?
We were very much, Mike, if you're listening, we were very much under house arrest here too, although not with the KGB or FSB on the doorstep. But fantastic story of comradeship in that cell. I mean, what a wonderful human dimension, and amazing guy. I wonder if Mike's free to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, because there may be a vacancy soon.
He'll have to fight me for it. But of course, Alison, you'll have the casting vote as our next Prime Minister. Now on to our listener emails. Your messages sent to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk. Please keep them coming. We learn so much from you, the citizens of Planet Normal.
This is from a follower on Twitter, actually, or X, Radian Chaser, who says, every business I talk to, including the one I lead, is looking at either massive job losses plus any cash into automation while passing costs on to customers and basically going into survival mode. Worse than 2008, worse than 2020, no end in sight. Diabolical. And S. Turner says 10,000 fewer civil servants is but a drop in the ocean. And I hope the 7,000 plus redundancies in the disbanded NHS England are not going to be included in that number. And this is one from Kit, Liam. Dear Alison and Liam, a few weeks ago I wrote to the Rocket of Right Thinking after reading a post by co-pilot Halligan about his travails in getting airtime with the media. In my note, I wondered if he would set up his own platform to educate and enlighten the uninitiated on economics. I was therefore delighted, says Kit, to see that he is set up on Substack. I immediately became a subscriber. Oh, well done, Kit, carrying favour there. Angling for a mug. We know these tactics. I immediately became a subscriber to Liam's Substack when the facts changed and took out an annual subscription. I would happily gift a subscription to Red Rachel at the Treasury, who is in desperate need of help and advice. Liam had a good platform on GB News, and I also listened to his show Money Talks and was bitterly disappointed when both ceased. Liam's knowledge and expertise was so wonderfully demonstrated in his recent appearance on Trigonometry with Konstantin Kishin and Francis Foster. I agree, Kit. Fantastic appearance by the Halligan. Looking quite fit as well, actually.
Steady,
Anyone who hasn't seen it should take a look. With that shock of just slightly tousled hair, he looked very professional. Good publicity and promotion. That's all he needs now. I look forward to all Liam's writings and can't wait to read his ruminations on our pretend Chancellor's next farce. Keep up all the good work, you two. As ever, Kit.
Well, that's very kind of you, Kit. Thank you. Thank you so much. Returning to the theme of businesses being hammered, businesses, of course, which generate all the wealth in an economy. There is no taxation without business. Every single worker who pays tax, they're paying tax because a business is giving them money to pay their tax. So we can't bang on enough about the huge increase in taxation on business. Dear Alison and Liam, this is from Mike. My partner and I run a business employing over 100 people that we started 18 years ago. Congratulations, Mike, and your partner. A year after starting the business, I remember the conversation about taking on our first employee. It's a big step. 3 mouths to feed instead of 2. A 50% increase in the wage bill overnight. However, we took the risk knowing that if it didn't work out, we could dismiss the new employee without the risk of them coming after us through an employment tribunal. We also knew that if they didn't turn up on day one and called in sick, we didn't need to pay them. This new employment bill removes these and many other protections and increases the risk significantly. Reflecting on that situation with the new rights that this bill gives employees on day one, I doubt we would be able to take the same risk of increasing our staff by 50%, the first, highest risk and one of the most important steps of starting to grow any business. Last year I was chatting to a friend, says Mike, who'd started his own CCTV and alarm business. He wanted to employ an additional engineer. He didn't yet have the work for the new employee, but felt it would follow. But he was so nervous about the cost, risk and responsibility of doing this that despite my encouragement, he didn't end up taking the risk. And that was under the existing employment rights regime. I doubt now a new employee would even be under consideration when these new laws come into effect. Labour will kill startups stone dead. Well done, Labour. Kind regards, Mike. Such an important point, Alison. Such an important point from Mike. And to repeat, he and his partner now employ over 100 people because they took that first step of employing a single person. And there's something else here, of course. The minimum wage is going up by almost 7%. The minimum wage for youngsters is going up by 16%. In early April. No one begrudges people money in their pockets, but if Labour want to get people off welfare, particularly young people, and into work, do not increase the minimum wage by 17%.
And I was told that a former Planet Normal guest, you can guess who it was, who runs an extremely successful hospitality business, is looking down the barrel at increased costs with all these job taxes of £5 million, right? So we can imagine how many people that person won't be taking on. This is from Laura, not her real name. Dear Alison and Liam, I've thought many times about writing in, having been a listener since the very first episode, but your latest podcast about the benefits bill prompted me to email at last. I'm a healthcare professional working with children at a large teaching hospital. There are the usual NHS issues with constant spending on the promotion of and mandatory training relating to diversity and equality. None of this money addresses the fundamental issues of lack of trained staff to cope with the vast explosion of complex medical needs. Management is bloated and out of touch, expecting frontline staff to do more with fewer and fewer highly skilled workers as people retire or go off sick. Predictably, says Laura, I wear my woke cloak. Now, Planet Normal listeners will know woke cloak was something that was a teenager wrote to say that's how she goes out to protect herself from our increasingly mad world. Predictably, Laura says, I wear my woke cloak where I can and try not to make my true feelings known. Some of the biggest issues I see day to day indicate that the benefits and immigration system is completely broken. Social issues have exploded in the last 5 years, and I'm not surprised by the rapidly increasing medical benefits bill. Families regularly call to request supporting letters for medical needs which are mild or not impacting their daily life. The end result being they are paid significant sums for looking after children with minor conditions. Many parents also cannot speak any English, nor do they work. It is a mystery how they have come into the UK, given friends of mine have found jumping through immigration hoops incredibly difficult, needing to earn high salaries to qualify and pass English-speaking tests. The result of this is that a lot of care is done via costly interpreters in our hospital, and clinical resources must be translated. We spend vast amounts of money on very poorly children who have been brought to the UK with their families stating they are coming because they will get better care here. I understand why, as a parent, you would want to come to the UK. What I don't understand is how our system allows it. There seems, says Laura, to be a fundamental feeling amongst colleagues that all medical care should be free for all, regardless of if you've been born in the UK or paid into the system through tax or national insurance. Anyone who dares to hint at an alternative opinion is met with blank or fearful stares. DEI diktats mean that any negative judgment of any kind is verboten. Their belief is that individuals should never be critiqued, as to do so is undoubtedly discriminatory. There is no requirement for personal responsibility anymore, nor any expectation that you should financially provide for your family. Now, whilst I believe the NHS and benefit system should help everyone when they're genuinely in need, I believe this system is open to deep abuse. Free at the point of use needs to be balanced with a spirit of fair play, where those of us who pay in have a reasonable expectation that their money is spent well. I worry about reprisals whenever I give any hint of my true opinions. It can be quite a suffocating and isolating way to work. And your podcast, Planet Normal, is my weekly reminder that I am not alone. Thank you, Laura.
And finally, this one's from Keith. Dear Alison and Liam, I love the podcast and enjoy listening every week. Thank you, Keith. Regarding Alison's lawsuit against Essex Police, do you think a campaign of direct action would help put an end to the injustice, says Keith, of non-crime hate incidents? If Planet Normal listeners were to overwhelm the police with reports of non-crime hate incidents against left-wing politicians and journalists, then perhaps we would see an end to this insanity. I'm not asking anyone to do anything illegal, says Keith. Each reported incident should be based on a real social media post that Planet Normal listeners find offensive. Hopefully such direct action will result in a return of sanity, free speech and the right to offend. Kind regards, Keith. And on that bombshell, that's it from Planet Normal for another week as we leave our sanctuary of sweet reason, our flying refuge of reason views. Email of the week, it's my turn and I'm going to give it to Laura. I think that was a wonderful email, Laura. So, Laura, send us your postal address in an email, put mug winner in the subject heading to planetnormal@telegraph.co.uk, and that Planet Normal mug will be winging its way towards you. Talking of Planet Normal mugs, Roger Bootle sitting opposite me with his Planet Normal mug. He's surreptitiously stuffing it into his briefcase as we speak. Roger, it's been great to have you here on Planet Normal. We're both huge fans of your writing, as I know many Telegraph readers are. We'll put a link to your columns in the show notes to this week's episode.
It was great fun. Thank you.
Roger, thank you for being our number one economist. And the
number two.
No, number three didn't do too badly, did he? I thought he did fine.
And as we speed away from our beloved Planet Normal, the madness of Planet Earth comes back into view. Thanks as ever to our producers Isabel Bouchard, Cass Ho and Louisa Wells, and to Roger Bootle. Stay safe and in touch with us and with each other. Until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.